He married me to tear my family's pride to shreds. But when he saw my small, frayed suitcase and the faded scars on my wrists, his eyes softened into something dangerous. He realized they hadn't lost a daughter. They had thrown me away. Before they fell in love, they signed a contract. Mine was quiet, like a held breath that no one dared to release. The synthetic lace of the altered bridal gown scratched against my collarbone. A constant, irritating reminder of exactly how much I was worth. I stood completely still in the center of the dimly lit room that had served as my bedroom for the last 10 years. It was less a bedroom and more of an attic storage space, smelling faintly of mothballs, damp wood, and forgotten things. The floorboards creaked under my weight, the only sound in the suffocating silence of my final hour in this house. Beatrice Mercer, my older sister, stood behind me, yanking the cheap zipper up my spine with unnecessary force. She smelled of heavy, expensive floral perfume, the kind that lingered in a room long after she left, dominating everything else in its path. She did not care if the metal teeth of the zipper caught my skin. She only cared that the transaction was completed on schedule, ensuring her own comfortable future remained entirely untouched. "Hold your breath," she snapped, her manicured fingers digging sharply into my pale shoulder blade. "If you ruin this seam, I am not paying a tailor to fix it. He is expecting a bride tonight, not a ragged charity case. Try to at least look the part, even if we both know you belong in the kitchen." I did not argue. I did not flinch. I merely drew a shallow breath and let the stiff, unforgiving fabric cage my ribs. Silence was the only armor I had ever known in this house. If I did not speak, I could not be punished for providing the wrong answer. If I did not cry, they could not enjoy the sight of my tears. Harrison Mercer stood in the doorway, checking the face of his heavy gold watch, his signet ring tapping a frantic, impatient rhythm against the doorframe. My father did not look at me with the sorrow of a man giving away his youngest child. He looked at me with the cold, calculating relief of an executive who had just managed to clear a massive corporate debt before the banks could seize his final assets. "The car is waiting downstairs," the patriarch said, his voice flat, clinical, and completely devoid of any paternal warmth. "You will not speak unless spoken to. You will not ask for anything. Damian Sterling is a ruthless, unforgiving man, and if you displease him, he will not hesitate to void the agreement. Do you understand me, Genevieve?" I nodded once, keeping my eyes fixed on the peeling yellow wallpaper near the baseboard. Choices vanish quickly when you're poor, when your mother is dying, and when your father leaves behind more debt than memories. Or, in my specific reality, when your father treats his own flesh and blood as collateral, trading you to a corporate rival, just to keep his mansion and his country club memberships intact. Beatrice stepped around to face me, her eyes sweeping critically over my pale face and the cheap, ill-fitting white dress they had forced upon me. Her gaze landed on the hollow of my throat, where a thin, tarnished silver locket rested against my skin. It was the only thing our mother had left me before she passed away. A tiny, financially worthless piece of metal that held nothing but a faded photograph. Without a single word of warning, my sister reached out, hooked her finger under the delicate chain, and yanked hard. The clasp snapped with a sharp, metallic click that echoed in the quiet room. I felt the sudden absence of the weight against my chest, a small, cold emptiness, blooming instantly where the silver had been resting. "You won't need this where you're going," the golden child murmured, slipping the locket into the pocket of her tailored silk trousers without an ounce of hesitation. "Sterling is giving you a life you don't deserve. Don't insult his wealth by bringing your sentimental garbage into his immaculate estate." I did not weep over the stolen necklace. I did not raise my hand to stop her, or beg for its return. I simply turned away from them both and walked toward the small creaking bed in the corner of the room. Sitting on the bare mattress was a single, slightly crushed cardboard box, the reinforced tape peeling at the edges. Inside the box were 3 worn paperbacks, a fraying gray woolen sweater, a battered sketchbook, and a handful of dull charcoal pencils. It was the entirety of my existence, boxed up and ready for disposal. There were no grand trunks, no designer luggage sets, no heirlooms to pass down, just a cardboard container that threatened to break if held incorrectly. I picked up the box, holding it tightly against my waist, anchoring myself to its meager weight. "I am ready," I whispered, my voice sounding thin and unfamiliar in the stale, dusty air. No one offered to help me carry my belongings. No one offered a goodbye embrace or a final word of comfort. I walked down the grand, sweeping staircase of my childhood home, like a ghost passing through the halls, completely unseen, entirely unmourned, and perfectly obedient to the end. The drive to the Pacific Northwest estate took 3 agonizing hours. The autumn sky was the color of bruised iron, weeping a heavy, relentless downpour that drummed, a frantic, deafening rhythm against the roof of the town car. The heater in the back seat was broken, or perhaps the hired driver simply hadn't bothered to turn it on for cargo he deemed unimportant. I sat shivering uncontrollably in the cracked leather seat, wearing only a thin, worn coat over the scratchy white gown. The damp chill from the window seeped through the inadequate fabric, settling deep into my bones. I stared out the rain-streaked glass, watching the bright city lights blur into dark, towering pines and winding, desolate coastal roads. I was fully aware of the man waiting for me at the end of this dark highway. Damian Sterling was a name whispered with a mixture of awe, reverence, and absolute terror in my father's elite circles. He was a ruthless tycoon, a reclusive billionaire who had spent the last 5 years systematically dismantling my family's corporate empire as revenge for some past betrayal I was never allowed to understand. This marriage was the final nail in the coffin, a total, humiliating surrender. He had demanded a daughter to finalize the destruction of the Mercer pride. They had simply handed him the one they never cared to protect, assuming I would absorb his wrath so they could continue their comfortable lives in peace. The car slowed significantly, the heavy tires crunching over a long, winding gravel driveway. Through the thick fog and the driving rain, the estate emerged like a fortress, carved from shadow and wet, unforgiving stone. There were no warm, inviting lights welcoming me, only the sterile, imposing glow of security lamps, illuminating the massive arched oak front doors. The car stopped abruptly. The engine cut off. For a long moment, there was absolutely nothing but the heavy, isolating sound of the rain battering the metal roof. The door clicked open, and the freezing coastal wind rushed in, biting sharply at my exposed ankles. A man in a sharp gray suit stood holding a large black umbrella, fighting the wind to keep it steady. Arthur Vance, the assistant, looked down at me with a polite, highly professional mask that faltered for just a fraction of a second when his eyes met mine. He had likely expected my sister. He had undoubtedly prepared himself for a loud, demanding socialite carrying heavy designer luggage, wearing furious indignation and shouting orders at the staff. Instead, he found a pale, trembling ghost clutching a damp cardboard container, looking entirely ready to collapse. "Ma'am," the man said quietly, offering his gloved hand to help me out of the vehicle. I did not take it. I was terrified that my bruised wrists would show if I extended my arm into the light. Instead, I slid out of the car independently, clutching my box even tighter to my chest, and stepped directly into the freezing puddles. My worn leather shoes soaked through instantly, the icy water freezing my toes. "Follow me, please," Arthur murmured, turning quickly to lead the way up the wide, slippery stone steps, ensuring the umbrella covered me as best as he could manage. The inside of the house was a massive cavern of cold marble, dark polished wood, and absolute, crushing silence. The air smelled of rain, lemon polish, and something sharp, like winter ozone and old paper. The foyer was vast, illuminated by a massive iron chandelier that cast long, skeletal shadows across the pristine hardwood floor. "Mr. Sterling is waiting in the drawing room," the assistant said, his voice hushed, gesturing toward a set of heavy double doors that had been left slightly ajar. I stepped forward, my wet, ruined shoes, making an embarrassing, squelching sound against the immaculate wood with every step I took. Water dripped steadily from the frayed hem of my coat, leaving a pathetic trail of dark spots behind me on the beautiful floor. I felt a sudden, crushing wave of panic. I was already ruining his perfect, sterile sanctuary before I had even spoken a word to him. I pushed the heavy door open with my shoulder, the cardboard box growing heavier in my numb, frozen fingers. The drawing room was massive, lined with breathtaking floor-to-ceiling windows that faced the raging coastal storm outside. A fire burned fiercely in the large stone hearth, but it did little to warm the vast, intimidating space. Standing by the window, with his hands clasped behind his back, was the man who had bought my life. He wore a dark, impeccably tailored suit that made his broad shoulders look like they were carved directly from granite. The tension in the room was immediately suffocating. He radiated a cold, calculating authority, standing completely still as he listened to my clumsy, wet footsteps entering his domain. I specifically told your father that I would not tolerate any delays, nor any of his typical theatrics, the tycoon said, his voice a low, resonant rumble that seemed to vibrate directly through the floorboards beneath my feet. It was the voice of a man accustomed to giving harsh orders that were immediately and flawlessly obeyed. He turned around slowly, a sharp, cutting reprimand ready on his lips. Fully prepared to tear into the spoiled heiress, he believed he had finally conquered. But the words never came. The speech died instantly in his throat, completely unvoiced. Damien stopped moving, his dark, intense eyes locking onto mine with an almost violent suddenness. The cold, triumphant glint of absolute corporate vengeance vanished from his expression, rapidly replaced by a sudden, jarring stillness that made the air in the room feel impossibly heavy. He looked at the cheap, wet coat clinging desperately to my shivering frame. He looked at the frayed, waterlogged leather of my worn shoes. His gaze tracked slowly upward, catching sight of the dark, fading yellow and purple bruises on my wrists, where my father had gripped me too tightly earlier that afternoon. Finally, his eyes settled on the damp cardboard box clutched desperately to my chest, the cheap tape visibly peeling away from the soaked cardboard. The silence in the room stretched, heavy, profound, and utterly deafening. The storm continued to batter against the glass outside, but inside this massive room, neither of us dared to move an inch. I felt my breath hitch painfully in my throat. I knew exactly what was coming next. The anger, the profound disgust. The realization that he had been cheated by my father, handed a broken, defective pawn instead of a gleaming, highly valued prize. I did not want to stand in the center of his beautiful, perfect room and ruin it with my pathetic presence. Slowly, deliberately, I backed away from the welcoming warmth of the fire. I moved toward the darkest corner of the room, near a heavy mahogany bookshelf where the shadows were thickest and most forgiving. I carefully lowered my box to the floor, terrified of scratching the polished wood, and then I sat down directly on top of it. I tucked my wet, freezing feet beneath the hem of my coat, trying to make myself as small and invisible as physically possible, silently waiting for him to yell at me. But Damien did not yell. He did not pick up the phone to call my father and void the contract in a fit of rage. Instead, the billionaire closed his eyes for a brief, incredibly heavy second, his jaw clenching so tightly, a muscle feathered violently beneath his skin. When he opened his eyes again, the coldness was entirely gone, replaced by a quiet, fierce intensity I had never seen directed at me by any human being before. He moved across the room, his footsteps completely silent on the expensive Persian rugs. I flinched involuntarily, bracing my shoulders, pressing my back flat against the cold stone wall, ready for the impact. He stopped a few feet away, deliberately respecting the physical boundary I had just drawn in my terror. He did not reach for me. He did not demand that I stand up and present myself to him. Without a single spoken word, the imposing man reached over to a nearby armchair, picked up a thick, heavy wool blanket, and walked the remaining distance toward my corner. The incredibly soothing scent of sharp cedarwood and clean linen washed over me a second, before the heavy fabric settled gently over my freezing shoulders. The warmth was instant and shocking. It felt like a physical blow to a body that had only ever known the cold. He crouched down slowly, bringing his eye level deliberately below mine, forcing himself to look up at me in the shadows so he would not tower over my seated form. He did not touch my skin, but his large, capable hands carefully tucked the thick edges of the cedarwood blanket around my shivering arms, sealing the warmth securely inside. "Arthur," he called out, his voice quiet, steady, and completely lacking any of the earlier imposing thunder he had used when my back was turned. The assistant appeared in the doorway almost instantly, standing at attention. "Turn up the heat in the entire house immediately," my new husband instructed softly, never once taking his dark eyes off my pale, terrified face. "Tell the kitchen to brew a pot of hot chamomile tea. And Arthur, lock the front gates. No one from the Mercer family is ever stepping foot on this property. Right away, sir, Arthur murmured, disappearing into the hallway like a shadow. I sat perfectly still under the heavy wool, my hands trembling violently as they gripped the soft edges of the blanket. I stared down at the pristine floor, entirely unable to meet his intense gaze. I had spent my entire life preparing to survive a monster, only to find myself sitting in the dark, wrapped safely in cedarwood, completely unmoored by a silent kindness I did not know how to survive. Morning came quietly. No trumpets, no shift in the universe. Just a pale beam of light, slipping through the tall windows, brushing against my shoulder like a second thought. I woke up in a bed large enough to swallow me whole, the heavy-down comforter smelling faintly of lavender, crisp ozone, and clean rain. For a long, disorienting moment, I lay perfectly still, my muscles locked tight, waiting for the harsh, metallic scrape of my bedroom door unlocking. I waited for Beatrice's sharp, demanding voice to cut through the silence, ordering me to fetch her dry cleaning or scrub the marble vanity before my father woke up. The silence stretched, uninterrupted, profound, and heavy. The air in the room was consistently warm, heated by a silent system that fought off the brutal Pacific Northwest storm, raging against the thick, double-paned glass outside. I sat up slowly. The oversized cedarwood blanket, from the night before, still pooled at the foot of the mattress, a tactile reminder that the previous evening had not been a hallucination. When I looked toward the sitting area, I realized my battered container of belongings had been moved from the floor. It wasn't thrown away. It was placed carefully on a polished mahogany side table, respected, handled as if it contained fragile, priceless glass rather than worn paperbacks and broken pencils. And draped across the back of the velvet armchair was a stack of carefully folded fabric. I approached the chair with the cautious, breathless hesitation of a stray animal anticipating a trap. There were no elaborate designer boxes stacked to the ceiling, no flamboyant displays of luxury meant to overwhelm me, no team of judgmental stylists waiting to scrutinize my physical flaws. There was only a quiet, anonymous delivery of woolen clothes. I reached out, letting my trembling fingertips brush against the top layer. The material was impossibly soft, woven from heavy, breathable yarn in muted shades of dove gray, soft cream, and deep, melancholic forest green. I traced the intricate stitching of a simple, thick sweater, feeling a strange, unfamiliar tightening in my chest. My entire life, my wardrobe had consisted of my older sister's discarded, ill-fitting hand-me-downs. They were cheap synthetic fabrics that pinched my ribs, broken-in zippers that caught my skin, and frayed hems that dragged pathetically on the floor. These garments were entirely different. They were sized perfectly for my slight, underfed frame, devoid of any ostentatious brand logos or flashy embellishments. They were not chosen to make me look like a glamorous trophy wife meant to decorate a billionaire's arm at high society galas. They were chosen entirely to keep me warm. The silent act of service, delivered without a single demand for gratitude or a grand dramatic presentation, felt heavier and more binding than any spoken vow. I dressed slowly, the thick wool settling against my bruised skin like a protective layer of armor. When I looked in the tall antique mirror, resting in the corner of the room, the girl staring back at me did not look like collateral damage anymore. She looked insulated. She looked safe. The routine of the house began to establish itself in the quiet, unspoken spaces between us. Damian Sterling was a man who commanded global empires, spending his daylight hours locked in his sprawling home office, orchestrating corporate takeovers with ruthless efficiency. Yet, the moment the sun dipped below the rugged coastal tree line, the atmosphere in the estate fundamentally shifted. The clinical coldness of the business world was left at the door, replaced by a dense, observant stillness. Our first dinners together were a masterclass in suffocating, unspoken tension. The main dining room was a massive cavern of dark oak and cold marble, dominated by a long, polished table that could easily seat 20 executives. In my father's house, there unremitted peed. I was rarely permitted to eat at the main table, usually relegated to the kitchen island after the wealthy guests had departed for the evening. I had fully expected my new husband to place me at the far opposite end of the vast mahogany expanse, isolating me across a sea of polished wood. Instead, The tycoon had specifically instructed the staff to set my place directly to his right. The physical proximity was terrifying. Every subtle shift of his broad shoulders, every quiet intake of his breath was magnified. Every clink of my heavy silver fork against the delicate porcelain plate felt like a gunshot echoing in the hushed room. I kept my head bowed, my shoulders drawn sharply inward, desperately trying to take up as little space as physically possible. The culinary spread presented by the kitchen was overwhelming, a contrast to the deliberate starvation tactics of my past. There were roasted meats dripping in rich, savory glazes, platters of seasoned root vegetables, warm, crusty bread, and delicate, sugar-dusted pastries. In the Mercer household, food was explicitly used as a weapon of control. If I spoke out of turn, my plate was removed. If Beatrice felt particularly spiteful, my daily portions were halved without explanation. I had learned to eat rapidly, silently, swallowing dry bites without chewing properly, constantly anticipating the exact moment the meal would be snatched away from me. I stared at the warm, golden bread rolls sitting in a woven basket near my elbow. The scent of melted butter and yeast filled the air, twisting my stomach with a deep primal anxiety. The abundance felt like a cruel trick, a temporary illusion that would vanish the moment I let my emotional guard down. Damien sat beside me, cutting his steak with precise, measured, economical movements. He did not force trivial conversation. He did not interrogate me about my corrupt father's ledgers or my cruel sister's whereabouts. He merely inhabited the space, his dark, intensely observant eyes occasionally flicking toward my plate, watching the way I held my fork in a white-knuckled, defensive grip. Slowly, under the guise of wiping my mouth, I reached for a bread roll. I didn't put it on my plate. With a trembling, highly practiced motion, born of a decade of survival, I slipped the roll beneath my thick linen napkin, sliding it discreetly onto my lap to hide it deep in the pocket of my new woolen cardigan. A secondary ration, a desperate guarantee against tomorrow's presumed hunger. You don't need to do that. The voice was resonant rumble that shattered the quiet rhythm of the room. I froze entirely, my heart slamming violently against my ribs like a trapped bird. I had been caught. The punishment would come now. I squeezed my eyes shut, my breath catching in a panicked, audible hitch, waiting for the inevitable anger, the raised voice, the cruel, humiliating dismissal. I slowly withdrew my shaking hand from my lap, placing the stolen bread back onto the pristine white tablecloth. It looked pathetic resting there, a glaring, undeniable symbol of my deeply ingrained brokenness. I kept my chin tucked firmly to my chest, my voice barely a fractured, trembling whisper. I'm sorry, please, I won't do it again. The heavy silence that followed was thick enough to drown in. Damien did not yell. He did not stand up and throw his napkin down in disgust. Instead, he carefully set his silver cutlery down on his plate. The sound was deliberate, calm, and utterly devoid of aggression. He turned his heavy oak chair slightly to face me. The formidable businessman leaned forward, closing the physical distance between us. Though he carefully kept his large hands flat on the table, ensuring he did not crowd my fragile boundaries or trigger my flinch response. Genevieve, he said softly. The way he pronounced my name, not as a curse, not as a calculated transaction, but as a living, breathing entity deserving of profound respect, made my chest ache with a sudden, sharp pressure. I forced myself to look up, bracing my fragile nerves for the absolute disgust I was certain I would find in his eyes. Instead, I found his dark gaze fixed on my pale face, with a terrifying absolute clarity. There was no pity in his expression, only a fierce, unyielding understanding that stripped away every lie I had ever told myself about being invisible. I heard you cry last night, the man murmured, his voice dropping to a low, raw cadence that bypassed my defensive walls completely. I didn't like it. I swallowed hard, the muscles in my throat tightening painfully. I didn't mean to disturb you. I tried to be quiet. I pressed the pillow over my face. You misunderstand me, Damien corrected softly, his jaw ticking slightly. I didn't mind the noise. I minded the reason. He shifted his gaze toward the grand, shadowed archway leading to the main hall. Arthur, he called out, his tone shifting instantly back to the sharp, commanding cadence of a CEO addressing his most trusted confidant. The loyal assistant materialized from the shadows almost instantly, a discreet phantom in a tailored gray suit. Yes, Mr. Sterling. Inform the kitchen staff, my husband instructed, his eyes returning entirely to my frightened, pale face. From this moment forward, the pantry and the main kitchen are to remain completely unlocked. 24 hours a day. There will be no schedules. There will be no rations. If my wife wants a full meal at 3 a.m, the staff will provide it, without question. If she wishes to hoard bread in her room, they will bake extra to accommodate her. Arthur bowed his head respectfully, completely unfazed by the unusual domestic directive. Consider it done, sir. Damien looked back at me, his expression softening just a fraction, a microscopic, beautiful crack in his impenetrable stoic armor. You do not have to hide your hunger in this house. You do not have to earn your meals with obedience. And you will never, under any circumstances, go to sleep starving again. Do you understand me? I stared at him, the heavy, comforting woolen fabric of my new sweater suddenly feeling like a literal, protective shield against a world that had always been far too cold. I could not form coherent words. My vocal cords refused to cooperate. I merely nodded, a single hot tear slipping down my cheek before I could physically stop it. He didn't demand a verbal thank you. He didn't ask me to explain the depths of my father's cruelty. He simply picked up his fork and quietly resumed his meal, leaving the bread roll exactly where I had placed it on the tablecloth, a silent, enduring invitation to take it whenever I was finally ready to believe him. Sometimes love doesn't knock, it waits. It lingers in the quiet delivery of a woolen sweater, in the silent patience of an unlocked door, waiting for you to realize you are finally safe. Days bled smoothly into weeks, the relentless coastal storms continually battering the thick stone walls of the estate, while the inside remained a quiet, heavily guarded sanctuary. The oppressive, suffocating fear that had entirely defined my miserable existence slowly began to mutate into a cautious, bewildered curiosity about the billionaire who had purchased my life. The tycoon spent the majority of his daylight hours locked away working, yet I began to notice a strange, persistent undercurrent of construction happening on the isolated south wing of the property. For a solid week, skilled carpenters and glassmakers moved quietly through the echoing halls. They were intensely respectful of my presence, never raising their voices, never leaving debris in the corridors. I stayed out of their way, wandering the vast, dusty library, tracing the gold-leaf spines of old books, trying my best to remain as invisible as I had always been taught to be. One morning, after a particularly restless night, plagued by vivid, suffocating nightmares of Beatrice's sharp perfume and my father's cold, transactional ledgers, I found Arthur standing patiently at the bottom of the grand wooden staircase. "Mr. Sterling requested that I show you to the south wing, ma'am," the assistant said, his tone incredibly gentle, lacking any of the stiff, corporate formality he typically used when speaking to the estate's staff. I hesitated on the bottom step, my fingers gripping the thick wooden banister so tightly. My knuckles turned stark white. Did I do something wrong? Did I break a rule? Arthur offered a rare, remarkably warm smile that reached the crinkled corners of his eyes. "Quite the opposite, Mrs. Sterling. Please, follow me." We walked together through the long, sunlit corridors. The heavy, historic silence of the house was broken only by the soft padding of my woolen socks against the polished hardwood. When we finally reached the very end of the secluded hall, Arthur stepped forward, pushed open a set of heavy, intricately carved wooden doors and stepped aside, bowing slightly to allow me to enter first. I crossed the massive threshold, and the breath vanished entirely from my lungs in a sharp gasp. It was a greenhouse. But it was not just a simple collection of potted plants. It was a custom-built, breathtaking architectural marvel of sweeping glass and curving wrought iron, specifically designed to trap the pale, elusive coastal sunlight, while keeping the harsh, freezing oceanic wind at a permanent distance. The air inside the room was dense, perfectly warm and incredibly rich. It smelled intensely of damp, fertile earth, sweet blooming jasmine, and crushing, intoxicating waves of fresh lavender. My chest heaved as I took a tentative step onto the heated stone floor. Severe agoraphobia and debilitating panic attacks had haunted me for years, a direct, undeniable result of being locked in that cramped, mothball-scented attic in my father's mansion. I had spent a decade desperately craving the open sky, but I remained utterly terrified of the vulnerable exposure it inevitably brought. This room, this magnificent, enclosed glass sanctuary, was the perfect, meticulous compromise. It offered the visual vastness of the outside world, the illusion of total freedom, while maintaining the absolute, impenetrable physical security of a stone fortress. But it was the very center of the room that made my knees tremble and my pulse race. Positioned perfectly to catch the optimal angle of the morning light was a large, sturdy, handcrafted wooden easel. Surrounding the easel were several smooth oak tables completely covered in brand new, staggeringly professional materials. There were dozens of pristine, stretched canvases of varying sizes, professional-grade sable brushes organized neatly in heavy glass jars, and expensive, imported tubes of oil paint in every vibrant color imaginable. I walked forward slowly, feeling as though I were stepping through a delicate dream that would shatter if I moved too quickly. My heart hammered a frantic, terrified rhythm against my ribs. I reached the main table, hovering my trembling hand over a thick tube of cerulean blue, completely terrified to actually make contact with it. In my small, pathetic cardboard box, I only possessed a few dull, broken charcoal pencils and a battered sketchbook filled with water-stained pages. My family had never allowed me the profound luxury of color. Art was considered a useless, messy distraction that generated no corporate profit, and I had been strictly, aggressively forbidden from wasting household resources on it. To see this massive abundance, this staggering, unapologetic investment in my silent, hidden passion, felt exactly like standing on the extreme edge of a jagged cliff. I hope the lighting is adequate for your needs. I spun around so fast I nearly tripped over the long hem of my woolen skirt. Damien stood in the doorway, his broad shoulders leaning casually against the iron frame. He had removed his formal suit jacket, and his crisp white dress shirt was rolled up to the forearms, revealing the corded muscle and faint, silvery scars on his skin that spoke of a history he had yet to share. I backed away from the table of supplies immediately, my hands flying behind my back like a guilty child caught stealing silver from the dining room. It's too much, I stammered rapidly, my voice thick with rising, uncontrollable panic. I can't. I don't know how to use these properly. They're far too expensive. If I ruin a canvas, I won't be able to pay you back. I don't have any money of my own. I don't have a trust fund. The panic attack hit me with the devastating force of a physical blow. My lungs seized up entirely, the rich, beautiful scent of lavender suddenly feeling overwhelmingly thick and suffocating. I squeezed my eyes shut, retreating mentally to the dark attic, waiting for my father's harsh reprimand about wasting his hard-earned wealth on foolish, worthless endeavors. I heard the soft, deliberate sound of Damien's leather shoes approaching across the stone floor. He didn't rush. He didn't try to grab my shaking shoulders or force me out of the psychological spiral with loud demands. He simply stopped a few feet away, planting himself right at the invisible edge of my personal boundary. Genevieve, look at me. The command was quiet, holding a deep, magnetic gravity that demanded compliance without invoking a single ounce of fear. I opened my eyes, my vision heavily blurred with unshed, terrified tears. The ruthless billionaire, a man who regularly destroyed entire corporations without a second thought, slowly lowered himself to the warm stone floor of the greenhouse. He sat down right there in his immaculate, wildly expensive tailored trousers, crossing his long legs, completely ignoring the damp soil near the large potted ferns. He reached up, grabbed a pristine, blindingly white canvas from the stack on the table, and pulled it down directly into his lap. Then, with deliberate, almost aggressive casualness, the stoic man picked up a large, expensive brush, dipped it directly into a jar of thick, unmixed black paint, and dragged it in a messy, jagged, completely ruined streak, straight across the center of the perfect white fabric. I gasped aloud, my hands flying up to cover my mouth in sheer visceral horror at the casual destruction of something so inherently valuable. Damien tossed the ruined brush aside carelessly and looked up at me from the floor, his dark eyes completely calm, holding my terrified gaze perfectly steady. There, the stoic man said softly, gesturing to the ruined canvas in his lap. It's already broken. It's already ruined. The first mistake has been made, and the sky did not fall. I did not deduct the cost from a ledger, and no one is going to punish you. I stared at the jagged, black line, processing the absolute finality of it, and then looked back down at the powerful man sitting in the dirt, just to prove a point to a frightened, broken girl. This house is not a museum, and you are not a prisoner working off a corporate debt. My husband continued, his voice wrapping around the fractured mind like the thick fabric of a winter coat. These supplies belong to you. If you want to paint masterpieces, paint them. If you want to take every single canvas in this room and cover it in black paint just to watch it dry, then do it. Mistakes carry no penalty here. You are allowed to take up space. The remaining, fearful breath shuddered out of my lungs in a single fractured sob. I collapsed to my knees on the warm stone floor, no longer caring about boundaries or rules or the invisible suffocating walls my father had built inside my mind. Damien didn't hesitate for a fraction of a second. He shifted forward, closing the final physical distance between us, and wrapped his strong, capable arms tightly around my trembling shoulders. He pulled me firmly against his solid chest, tucking my head safely beneath his chin. I buried my wet face in his crisp white shirt, the intoxicating scent of cedarwood, clean rain, and expensive soap anchoring me completely to the present reality. I wept. For the stolen locket, for the decade lost in the attic, for the bread I had hidden in my pockets, and for the terrifying, incredibly beautiful realization that the man who had bought my family's ruin was quietly, painstakingly building my sanctuary. And for the very first time in my entire life, I didn't try to be quiet. The following weeks settled into a quiet, rhythmic pattern of healing, defined not by grand gestures, but by the steady, profound accumulation of trust. Damien Sterling did not hide his wealth, nor did he attempt to hide the intricate, ruthless mechanics of how he maintained his corporate empire. In the center of the vast, dusty library, resting casually on a polished mahogany table, sat his primary corporate ledger. I traced my fingers over the embossed gold lettering on the cover, recognizing the sheer power resting harmlessly beneath my hands. The ledger contained routing numbers, offshore accounts, and the fragile architectural blueprints of Damien's entire empire. Leaving it out in the open was a deliberate, staggering act of vulnerability. He trusted me implicitly, offering me unrestricted access to the very financial information my corrupt father had spent years desperately trying to acquire. It was on a particularly gray, rain-washed Tuesday afternoon that the fragiles of my new sanctuary was abruptly shattered. The coastal storm had returned, battering the thick glass of the greenhouse with a relentless, rhythmic drumming that usually brought me immense peace. Arthur was occupied at the main gates, managing a shift change for the security detail, which left the secondary entrance near the south wing momentarily unguarded. I was sitting in the center of the warm, lavender-scented greenhouse, my hands covered in pale blue oil paint, entirely absorbed in the soothing motion of my brush against the canvas. The air inside my sanctuary was perfectly heated, thick with the smell of damp earth and blooming jasmine. I could hear the sharp, impatient clicking of stiletto heels, echoing ominously down the stone corridor long before she actually appeared. I froze, the brush halting midway across the canvas, a drop of cerulean blue paint falling silently to the heated floor, and then, cutting through the delicate botanical atmosphere, like a poisoned blade, came the heavy, suffocating stench of synthetic roses and expensive chemical perfume. I did not need to turn around to know who had breached my sanctuary. I had spent a decade shrinking away from that exact scent in the dark corridors of the Mercer mansion. So this is where the little ghost has been hiding. Beatrice's sharp, demanding voice echoed off the curving glass walls. I turned slowly, my woolen sweater wrapping around my shoulders like a protective shield. My older sister stood in the doorway, her sharp heels sinking carelessly into the damp soil near the threshold. She looked entirely out of place, a rigid, toxic monument of high society vanity, standing in the middle of my quiet, organic refuge. Her eyes swept over the expensive easels, the imported paints, and finally landed on my face with absolute, unmasked disdain. You have always been utterly useless, Genevieve, but you are going to make yourself useful today. Beatrice snapped, crossing her arms over her tailored silk blouse. Father is furious. You were supposed to be our inside access, yet you haven't answered a single phone call. The company is facing immediate liquidation, and Sterling is systematically starving our credit lines. We need his account routing numbers to freeze his assets before he destroys us completely. I know you have unrestricted access to his office, she demanded, taking a step further into the greenhouse. Get me the corporate ledger now. When I did not immediately comply, Beatrice's expression twisted into a cruel, calculated smirk. She reached into her expensive designer handbag and slowly pulled out an object, holding it up to the pale afternoon light. It was my mother's silver locket. The thin, tarnished silver chain hung limply from her fingers, catching the faint reflection of the greenhouse lights. It was the only tangible possession I had ever cherished, containing a faded photograph of the mother I barely remembered. Beatrice had snatched it from me right before I left the estate, taking it simply because she enjoyed watching me quietly mourn its loss. I found this rotting in the bottom of my bag, Beatrice murmured, tracing her manicured nail over the delicate clasps. Be a good, obedient little sister, Genevieve. Go fetch Sterling's ledger, and I will give it back to you. Refuse me, and I will drop it onto these stone floors and crush it beneath my heel. In the past, the threat would have paralyzed me entirely. I would have cowered, wept, and desperately negotiated to protect the tiny, fragile piece of my mother's memory. I would have betrayed my own moral compass just to survive her cruelty for one more day. But as I stood there in the warm, cedarwood-scented safety of Damien's estate, a profound, unyielding realization washed over me. I looked at the tarnished silver locket in her perfectly manicured hand, and then I looked at the vast, beautiful greenhouse built entirely to protect my dignity. The locket was just a piece of metal. It held no power over me anymore, because I was no longer a starved, desperate child begging for crumbs of affection. I set my paintbrush down carefully on the oak table. I walked across the heated stone floor, closing the physical distance between us with slow, deliberate steps. Beatrice's smirk widened in triumphant satisfaction, fully believing she had won the psychological game. I reached out and took the silver locket from her hand. I held it for a brief, heavy second, feeling the familiar, worn grooves of the metal against my palm. And then, without uttering a single word of explanation, I placed the locket right back into Beatrice's palm. Her smirk vanished instantly, replaced by a look of sheer, uncomprehending shock. Before she could process the quiet rejection, I stepped backward, grabbed the heavy brass handle of the oak door, and pulled it shut directly in her face. The heavy lock clicked into place with a sharp, echoing finality, sealing her outside in the damp, cold corridor, completely cutting off her toxic perfume from my sanctuary. I did not wait to watch her reaction through the glass. I turned away, walked straight out the opposite door of the greenhouse, and made my way toward the library. I picked up the heavy black leather ledger from the mahogany table, cradling the vulnerable financial secrets of the Sterling Empire against my chest. I walked down the long, shadowed hallway to Damien's private study. The heavy oak door was slightly ajar. I pushed it open and stepped inside. Damien sat behind his massive desk, his reading glasses perched on the bridge of his nose, reviewing a stack of legal documents. He looked up, his dark eyes instantly assessing my tense posture and the slight tremor in my hands. I walked up to his desk and placed the corporate ledger directly in the center of his workspace. I didn't speak. I didn't need to explain that my family had just tried to use my deepest childhood trauma to manipulate me into betraying him. I simply handed him the very weapon they desperately wanted to use to destroy him, surrendering it entirely to his control. Damien looked at the ledger, and then his intense gaze shifted up to meet mine. He processed the absolute loyalty in my silent action. He didn't ask interrogating questions. He didn't demand an extensive, exhausting verbal report of what had just transpired. Instead, the ruthless billionaire reached across the polished wood of his desk, his large, warm hand covering my trembling fingers. His thumb brushed gently against my knuckles, a silent, profound vow of absolute protection that anchored me completely. The Mercer family had played their final card, and they had lost entirely. A week after the incident with the ledger, a thick, cream-colored envelope arrived at the estate, bearing an elegant wax seal. It was a formal invitation to the annual Pacific Northwest Maritime Gala, the most exclusive, high-stakes social event of the year, attended by the region's wealthiest and most ruthless corporate elite. Damien did not order me to attend as a decorative trophy to boost his public image. He handed me the invitation directly, his expression perfectly neutral, offering me the absolute choice to remain safely hidden in our quiet sanctuary, or to step out and face the ghosts of my past. Not because I wanted to wear expensive jewelry, and not because I craved the superficial attention of high society, but because I refused to hide anymore. I chose to stand beside him. The preparation for the evening was quiet and intimate. I wore a heavy, elegant emerald silk gown that Arthur had discreetly ordered for me. It possessed no ostentatious, flashy embellishments, and left no skin uncomfortably exposed. It felt like a soft, graceful layer of armor. I wore no diamonds, no extravagant tiaras to signal wealth. I only wore the quiet, unyielding dignity of a woman who had finally learned her own worth. Damien wore a stark, immaculate tuxedo that emphasized the formidable, granite-like broadness of his shoulders. When he offered me his arm in the foyer, the faint, comforting scent of cedarwood and crisp ozone completely erased my lingering anxiety. The drive into the city was a blur of rain-streaked lights. When we finally arrived at the grand ballroom, the sheer scale of the event hit me like a physical wave. The venue was a massive architectural marvel of cold white marble, towering glass pillars, and glittering, multi-tiered crystal chandeliers that cast a harsh, unforgiving glare over the gathered elite. The air was thick with the hum of predatory corporate conversations, the sharp clinking of expensive crystal champagne flutes, and the suffocating, heavy pressure of 1,000 judging eyes tracking our every movement. For a brief, terrifying fraction of a second, the overwhelming atmosphere triggered a sharp echo of my old agoraphobia. My breath hitched, and I instinctively pulled my shoulders inward. But Damien's solid, warm presence beside me acted as an immediate grounding anchor. He shifted his stance slightly, subtly angling his broad body to shield me from the worst of the crowd's invasive stares. We moved through the ballroom with a quiet, undeniable authority. It did not take long for the inevitable confrontation to occur. Across the detail-tiered suits and designer gowns, Harrison Mercer spotted us. My father was no longer the imposing, terrifying figure of my childhood. He looked ragged, desperate, and entirely unmoored. Without the stolen routing numbers from the corporate ledger, the Mercer empire was rapidly bleeding out, suffocated by Damien's relentless, calculated financial siege. His usually immaculate face was red and sweating heavily against his stiff, expensive collar. Ignoring all established rules of high society protocol, Harrison marched aggressively across the marble floor, pushing past startled guests to reach us. His eyes were wide with a desperate, impotent rage, completely bypassing Damien to focus entirely on me. "You insolent, ungrateful girl," Harrison hissed, his voice vibrating with a toxic mixture of panic and fury as he closed the final few feet between us. He reached out aggressively, his fingers hooking like desperate talons, intent on grabbing my bare wrist to physically drag me away from the only safety I had ever known. The sudden, violent motion triggered a visceral, deeply ingrained micro-flinch in my spine. My lungs seized, anticipating the sharp, familiar pain of his bruising grip. The pain never arrived. Damien's reaction was instantaneous and utterly terrifying. Before my father's desperate fingers could even brush the fabric of my sleeve, Damien stepped firmly in front of me. His large, capable hand shot out, clamping around Harrison's extended wrist with the crushing, immovable force of an iron vice. A loud, sickening sound of shifting bone, and Harrison gasping in sudden, sharp pain echoed clearly over the soft classical music playing in the background. Damien twisted the older man's arm just a fraction of an inch, locking him completely in place, rendering him entirely powerless. The immediate area around us fell into a dead, suffocating silence. The surrounding elite paused their conversations, their crystal glasses hovering in mid-air, watching in shocked fascination as the untouchable Damien Sterling physically restrained a fellow patriarch. Damien did not shout. He did not cause a vulgar, melodramatic scene. His voice dropped into a low, lethal register that carried 1,000 times more weight than any furious scream. "Tell me to stop," Damien whispered to me, his dark, intensely furious eyes never once leaving my father's pale, terrified face. "Say the word, Genevieve, and I will let him go." But if you remain silent, I will end him entirely. I stood perfectly still, shielded behind the immense, protective wall of my husband's broad back. I looked at the patriarch who had starved me, locked me in an attic, and sold my future to clear his own debts. I looked at the father who had never once offered me a shred of warmth or protection. I felt absolutely no pity. I remained completely, peacefully silent. Damien caught the quiet finality of my decision. He gave a slow, satisfied nod. He released Harrison's wrist with a sudden, dismissive shove, letting the older man stumble awkwardly backward into a sitting table, completely shattering his carefully maintained dignity. Without breaking eye contact with the ruined man, Damien lifted his hand and gave a single, subtle nod to Arthur, who was standing discreetly near the ballroom entrance, holding a sleek tablet. It was the final, prearranged signal. In that exact second, the execution of the Mercer credit lines was completed. The final blow to their corporate empire was delivered quietly, efficiently, and with absolute permanence. Harrison stared at Arthur, then back at me, the horrific realization of his total financial ruin finally settling into his features. His chest he heaved with impotent rage. "This is how you pay me back," the patriarch hissed, his voice trembling violently as he pointed a shaking finger at my face. "After everything I provided for you? After the food on your plate and the roof I kept over your head?" Damien stepped forward, completely blocking my father's line of sight, a solid, unyielding fortress of dark fabric and unwavering devotion. "You provided nothing but collateral," Damien stated coldly, his words ringing out clearly in the hushed ballroom. "You treated her as a transaction, and the transaction is now permanently closed. You have lost all right to speak to my wife. If you, or Beatrice, ever attempt to approach her again, I will personally ensure you do not have the financial resources to buy a cup of coffee in this city. You are nothing to her now." The silence in the room was absolute. No one dared to defend the Mercer patriarch. His ruin was public, undeniable, and entirely of his own making. Damien did not wait for a response. He turned away from the trembling, defeated man, his expression softening instantly, the second his eyes met mine. He offered me his arm, his gesture respectful, patient, and deeply protective. I placed my hand gently in the crook of his elbow, feeling the steady, reassuring heat of his skin beneath the dark fabric of his tuxedo. Together, we turned our backs on the wreckage of my past and walked steadily toward the grand exit of the ballroom, leaving the suffocating whispers of the elite far behind us. We stepped out of the heavy glass doors and out into the cool, rain-washed Pacific Northwest night. The sharp, clean scent of wet pine and distant ocean air filled my lungs, washing away the toxic, cloying atmosphere of the gala. The heavy burden of my family's expectations, their cruelty, and their debts finally lifted off my shoulders, evaporating into the dark sky. As we walked toward the waiting car, sheltered beneath the wide canopy of Arthur's black umbrella, I leaned my head gently against Damien's strong shoulder. I looked up at the husband who had bought my ruin and instead built my sanctuary, realizing a profound truth. The morning after the Pacific Northwest Maritime Gala, the imposing stone estate was wrapped in a profound, meditative silence. The coastal storm had finally broken, leaving behind a pale, fragile silver light that filtered through the tall, arched windows of the main hall. I stood alone in the center of the vast drawing room, my fingers lightly trailing over the cold, polished surface of the mahogany furniture. For the first time in my entire existence, I did not feel the oppressive, suffocating weight of my father's expectations pressing down on my spine. The Mercer Empire was officially, irrevocably dismantled. The ledger had been closed. The transaction was complete, but the outcome was nothing like the brutal execution my family had anticipated. Instead of being destroyed, I had been profoundly, quietly saved. Damien Sterling walked into the room, his footsteps completely silent on the thick Persian rug. He wasn't wearing his formidable corporate armor, the immaculate, sharply tailored suits that made him look like a monument carved from dark granite. He wore a simple, unbuttoned charcoal sweater and soft linen trousers. The rigid, calculated tension that usually radiated from his broad shoulders had entirely evaporated, replaced by a deep, weary peace. He stopped beside me, looking out through the rain-streaked glass toward the distant, churning gray ocean. He didn't speak immediately. He understood that the silence between us was no longer a held breath. It was a deeply peaceful exhale. We were standing in the aftermath of a war he had fought entirely to protect my dignity. And now that the battlefield was clear, the massive stone fortress suddenly felt entirely unnecessary. "Arthur has finalized the asset freeze," Damien murmured, his low, resonant voice vibrating comfortably in the quiet space. "Harrison and Beatrice have been permanently locked out of all accounts. They will never have the resources to approach you, threaten you, or manipulate you again. The security has been updated, but..." He paused, his dark eyes shifting from the window to my face. "I don't want you to spend the rest of your life looking over your shoulder. And I don't want to keep you locked inside a fortress, even if it is a beautiful one." I turned to face him, observing the faint silvery scars on his forearms, the physical evidence of a man who had spent his entire life fighting to survive the ruthless mechanics of his world. "Where would we go?" I asked softly, the question lacking any trace of fear. "Away from the glass and the marble," my husband replied, reaching out to gently tuck a stray lock of hair behind my ear. His thumb brushed against my cheek, a silent, profound vow of absolute safety. "I have a property, a quiet coastal orchard house further north. It isn't grand, it isn't a symbol of wealth, but it is entirely ours." The realization hit me with the gentle, overwhelming force of a rising tide. Leaving the city was not an exile. It was not a retreat forced by external pressure. It was Damien willingly, deliberately abandoning his corporate high tower. He was choosing to step away from the absolute apex of his billionaire empire, prioritizing my mental and physical healing in a low-stimulus, natural environment over his relentless pursuit of financial dominance. He was trading his ruthlessness for my peace. The process of packing was a quiet, deeply symbolic ritual. I did not summon a team of maids to carefully fold expensive designer gowns into matching leather trunks. I did not pack the elegant emerald silk dress I had worn to the gala, leaving it hanging perfectly still in the massive walk-in closet, as a monument to a past I no longer needed to carry. Instead, I knelt on the heated stone floor of my bedroom, pulling a simple, soft canvas duffel bag toward me. I folded the muted, high-quality woolen clothes I had been anonymously gifted during my first week, the soft creams, the dove grays, the deep forest greens that had served as my first layer of physical armor. I walked down the long, sunlit corridor to the lavender-scented greenhouse. The air was thick with the smell of damp earth and blooming jasmine. I bypassed the untouched canvases and the lavish imported easels. I only reached for the professional-grade sable paintbrushes, carefully rolling them into a protective canvas wrap. They smelled faintly of linseed oil and cerulean blue pigment. They were the tools of my reclaimed voice, the instruments my protector had purchased not to show his wealth, but to prove that my mistakes carried no penalty. Finally, I returned to the bedroom and picked up the heavy cedarwood blanket. The thick wool still smelled of clean rain and expensive soap. It was the very first item he had given me, wrapped around my shivering shoulders on the night. I arrived with nothing but a frayed cardboard box. I folded it with absolute, painstaking care, pressing my hands flat against the fabric, feeling the deep ingrained memory of the exact moment I realized I was finally safe. Damien stood in the doorway, watching me slide the folded wool into the duffel bag. He looked at my meager belongings, my paintbrushes, my sweaters, and his old blanket, and a microscopic, beautiful crack appeared in his stoic facade. He realized completely, and without a shadow of a doubt, that my recovery was tied entirely to him, not the sprawling wealth he controlled. I didn't want his empire. I only wanted the man who had sat on the floor and ruined a canvas just to make me smile. Before we departed, we met Arthur Vance in the vast, dusty library. The loyal assistant stood by the mahogany table, his posture perfectly straight, holding a thick leather folder. The tycoon didn't convene a loud, aggressive boardroom meeting to hand over his empire. He simply signed his name on 3 pieces of heavy, cream-colored parchment, transferring the daily operations and executive control of Sterling Enterprises entirely to his trusted confidant. "Keep the gates locked, Arthur," Damien instructed quietly, sliding the pen back into its gold holder. "If anyone asks for me, tell them the CEO is permanently unavailable." "It has been an honor, Mr. Sterling," Arthur murmured, offering a rare, remarkably warm smile that reached the crinkled corners of his eyes. He looked at me, giving a small, respectful bow. "Have a peaceful journey, Mrs. Sterling." The drive north was entirely different from the terrifying, freezing journey that had originally brought me to the estate. The town car was gone, replaced by a rugged, understated utility vehicle. Damien drove himself, his large, capable hands resting easily on the leather steering wheel. I sat in the passenger seat, not shivering in a scratchy synthetic gown, but swathed comfortably in my thick gray sweater. The heater hummed a steady, warm rhythm, pushing the sharp chill of the Pacific Northwest autumn completely out of the cabin. I watched the landscape shift through the rain-streaked glass. The towering, clinical skyscrapers of the city gradually faded into dark, winding coastal roads, bordered by massive ancient pines. The sky was the color of bruised iron, but the heavy, relentless downpour didn't isolate me anymore. It simply insulated us, wrapping our small, moving sanctuary in a blanket of white noise. We arrived at the coastal orchard house, just as the late afternoon sun began to break through the thick gray clouds, casting long golden shadows across the damp earth. The property was a modest, simple structure featuring weathered wood siding that had been bleached pale by years of harsh sea winds. It was entirely surrounded by rows of old, twisting apple trees that bowed deeply toward the rugged coastline. There were no towering glass pillars. There was no cold marble flooring or echoing, cavernous drawing rooms. When Damien unlocked the front door and pushed it open, the air inside smelled of old wood, dried herbs, and the faint, salty tang of the nearby ocean. The floors were made of scuffed, sun-bleached timber that creaked comfortably beneath our boots. The kitchen counters were chipped and worn from years of quiet, practical use. It was a home, not a museum. Our days shifted into a slow, meditative rhythm that had absolutely nothing to do with offshore accounts, high society expectations, or toxic family secrets. The first morning we awoke in the small house for staffs, there were no waits silently outside our door. Instead, my husband rose before the sun, padding quietly barefoot across the wooden floorboards. I found him in the kitchen an hour later, standing by the rustic stove, his broad shoulders relaxed beneath a soft cotton shirt, as he brewed a pot of warm chamomile tea. The ruthless corporate titan, who had systematically crushed my father's massive empire, was now carefully pouring hot water into two mismatched ceramic mugs. He handed me one, his thumb gently brushing against mine as I took it. The steam rose between us, carrying the soothing scent of chamomile, and filling the quiet, sunlit kitchen with a profound sense of domestic warmth. I held the mug with both hands, letting the heat seep into my palms, completely unmoored by the simple, beautiful reality of my new life. The true depth of our healing did not fully manifest until the end of our first week at the orchard. Damien had quietly arranged for a local nursery to deliver dozens of young lavender plants, their delicate purple blooms filling the coastal air with a rich, intoxicating fragrance that instantly reminded me of my old sanctuary. As the late afternoon sun began to dip toward the horizon, casting a warm, amber glow over the rugged landscape, we walked out into the small patch of turned earth near the back porch. Damien Sterling, a man who had never performed a single day of manual labor in his entire privileged existence, did not hire a landscaping crew to complete the task. He did not issue cold commands from the comfort of a home office. Instead, the billionaire dropped to his knees directly in the damp, dark soil. He wore an old, faded shirt, completely disregarding the mud that immediately stained the fabric and coated his tailored trousers. He picked up a small iron trowel and began to dig the planting holes himself, his scarred, powerful hands working the earth with clumsy, tender determination. He was physically building a living, breathing sanctuary for me, rooting it deep into the ground with his own hands. I knelt beside him, my woolen skirt settling into the dirt without a second thought. I watched the way his muscles bunched and shifted under his shirt as he carefully transferred a fragile root ball from its plastic container into the freshly dug hole. He patted the damp soil around the base, his fingers completely caked in dark mud, his chest heaving slightly from the physical exertion. A sudden, overwhelming wave of emotion swelled in my throat, thick and suffocating in its intensity. I reached out, my pale, clean fingers wrapping gently around his large, dirt-covered wrist. The contrast between us was stark, but the connection was absolute. Damien froze instantly, the iron trowel slipping from his grasp, to fall silently into the soft earth. He slowly turned his head to look at me, his dark, intensely observant eyes searching my face for any sign of hesitation or fear. He was waiting for me to establish the boundary. He was waiting for me to pull away. "Say the word and I'll pull away," I whispered, my voice trembling, testing the limits of my own agency. I was testing the incredible, terrifying vulnerability of loving a man who held the power to destroy worlds, but chose to plant flowers instead. He didn't pull his hand away. He didn't try to wipe the mud from his skin before he turned his palm upward, gently interlacing his dirty fingers with my clean ones. He lowered his head, resting his forehead against mine right there in the damp garden, the scent of crushed lavender and wet earth, wrapping around us like a protective shroud. True devotion doesn't always announce itself. It simply endures, my husband countered softly, his voice a low, raw cadence that bypassed every defensive wall I had ever built. "I will wait in this dirt for the rest of my life if it means you never have to be afraid again." He yielded all his pride, all his corporate dominance, and all his power in that single, quiet breath. The central contradiction of our existence was finally resolved. The very person who had bought my family's ruin had become my absolute savior, proving that true revenge was not about destroying those who hurt us, but about building a beautiful, untouchable life for the one they cast aside. Every evening, as the coastal rain began to softly drum against the tin roof of our small house, Damien would build a fire in the rustic stone hearth. The crackling wood provided a steady, comforting rhythm to our quiet nights. I would sit on the woven rug, wrapping the familiar, heavy blanket around my shoulders, my paintbrushes resting on a small wooden table nearby. He would sit beside me, his long legs stretched out toward the warmth, and simply pull me against his chest. We didn't need to speak. We had traded offshore accounts and sterile marble for scuffed floors and chipped mugs. We had traded high society galas for the quiet, unyielding dignity of a shared life. As the last light of day wrapped us in the warm, golden glow of the hearth, I looked at the man beside me. I rested my hand over his steady, beating heart, feeling the slow, powerful rhythm beneath my palm. I finally understood the quiet vow he had made to me from the very beginning. A promise written not in ink on a corporate contract, but in the silent, everyday acts of service that had painstakingly stitched my fractured soul back together. Home isn't a place or a name, it's a person. Before you go, take a deep, quiet breath. This story doesn't rush. It lingers in quiet rooms between unfinished words, in the spaces where love is found without being spoken. If you are someone who believes that true love doesn't shout, but waits patiently in the peaceful moments of the morning, please leave a comment, like this video, and subscribe to the channel. Thank you for spending your evening with us in this sanctuary, and I will meet you in the next story.